She had survived an ocean crossing, 2 years of backbreaking labor, and the daily cruelty of men who looked at her face and decided she didn't belong. But tonight, bleeding in the storm, Lena Hao wondered if survival was just another word for suffering. Then a voice cut through the howling, dark, rough, uncertain, but unmistakably human. You gonna sit there and freeze, or are you going to let me help? She looked up at the cowboy standing in the rain, hand extended, and made a choice that would change both their lives forever. Stay until the end and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. The storm hit Dustfall like a fist nobody saw coming. It rolled in from the northwest in the space of an hour, the kind of Wyoming storm that didn't bother announcing itself, that simply arrived and remade the world into something gray and violent and indifferent to whatever human arrangements had been made inside it. Thunder cracked overhead like cannon fire, and the single lantern hanging above the entrance to Chen's general store swung wildly on its hook, throwing lurching shadows across the muddy street below. Lena Hao pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of that store and tried to make herself small. She was already good at that. 2 years in America had taught her the necessary art of compression, how to fold herself down to take up less space, to move through rooms and streets in a way that invited the least possible notice. It was survival, plain and simple. Dustfall, Wyoming Territory, 1882. Population 463. 462 who wished she had never arrived. Blood mixed with rainwater on the left side of her face, dripping from the cut above her eyebrow, where the rock had found its mark. She touched it carefully, fingers coming away dark red even in the dim light. The cut was not deep enough to kill her, she understood that, but it throbbed with the particular cruelty of wounds delivered not out of necessity, but out of sport. She could still hear the men who had chased her from the boarding house. Their voices had been loose with whiskey and righteous with something uglier, the kind of righteousness that required a target. Go back where you came from. We don't need your kind here. She had tried to explain, had counted out her coins on the landlord's counter, enough for 1 week's rent, earned dish by dish at the saloon, her hands raw from lye soap and hot water. The landlord had looked at her face the way people here always looked at her face, and then he had closed the door. Not slammed it, just closed it quietly, which was somehow worse. And then the men had come as they always came when someone signaled that a woman like her was vulnerable and alone. The rock had been small, thrown more for the pleasure of the throwing than for any serious harm, but it had found her, and she had run stumbling through the mud while laughter followed her into the dark. Lena drew her knees up against her chest and let the rain fall. Her clothes clung to her like a second skin, heavy and cold. She had nowhere to go. That was the simple arithmetic of her situation, the problems she had been turning over in her mind since she stopped running. The boarding house was closed to her. The hotel charged $3 a night more than she earned in a week. She had tried the church once 2 months ago when she had first arrived in Dustfall with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a letter of introduction from a missionary in San Francisco who was himself Chinese and therefore carried no weight with anyone in this valley. The Reverend, a thin man named Marsh, had looked at her with something that was almost kindness and said things she didn't fully understand about God's plan before gesturing her gently but firmly toward the door. She had learned to read gestures. They were a language more universal than words. So she sat in the rain and bled and thought about her mother's face the morning she had left Guangdong province. Her father's voice saying, "You have to survive, Lena. You have to make it to America where there is work." She thought about the ocean crossing, 3 weeks in the belly of a ship that groaned and shifted like a living thing, surrounded by other people with other desperate calculations playing out behind their eyes. She thought about San Francisco and the boarding houses there run by men who paid in insults and called it generosity. She had come so far. That was the terrible part. She had come so far, and the distance seemed to mean nothing. You picked a hell of a night to give up. The voice came out of the rain without warning, and Lena's head snapped up fast, which she immediately regretted. Pain lanced through her skull in a white-hot line from the cut above her eye. She blinked through the rain at the figure standing a few feet away. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that had seen better decades and a hat that dripped water from its brim like a broken gutter. He wasn't young, maybe 35, maybe 40, with the kind of face that weather and work had carved into something more angular than it had probably started. He wasn't looking at her with disgust. He wasn't looking at her with pity either, that particular expression she had learned to recognize and dread, the look that preceded the speech about how unfortunate her circumstances were. And wasn't it a shame before whoever was delivering it found somewhere else to be? He was just looking, like she was a fact he was trying to account for. I heard you, Lena said. Her English was serviceable. 2 years of practice, the missionary's insistence that words are survival, Lena's silence is death. And she deployed it carefully the way she deployed everything she had. The man tilted his head slightly. What do you call sitting in a storm then? Waiting. For what? She didn't have an answer to that. Or rather, she had too many answers, and none of them would survive being spoken aloud. She was waiting for the storm to pass, waiting for the world to stop being what it was, waiting for the calculation of her life to come out different. The man studied her for a long moment. Rain hammered the street between them, turning the packed earth to brown soup. Then he shook his head slowly, the gesture carrying a weight she couldn't quite read. You're bleeding, he said. I know. You going to do something about that? Like what? He sighed, a sound almost swallowed by the wind, and did something Lena did not expect. He walked closer, not fast, not aggressive, deliberate the way a person moved toward an animal they didn't want to frighten further. When he was close enough that she could see his face clearly, weathered young, despite the lines around his eyes carrying some stubborn set to the jaw that suggested he'd earned every one of those lines through sheer refusal to quit. He crouched down in front of her and met her gaze directly. Name's Wade Calloway, he said. I've got a ranch about 3 miles out. It's not much, but it's got a roof and a stove. You want shelter, you've got it. Lena stared at him. This was a trick. It had to be a trick. Men here did not offer help to women like her without wanting something in return, and what they wanted from women alone and foreign and desperate was something she would die before giving. She had learned that lesson thoroughly and at considerable cost. Why, she asked. Wade Calloway was quiet for a moment. Rain continued its assault. Beyond them, the lantern above the general store swung in a gust and threw a shadow long and broken across the mud. Finally, he said, because you're sitting in a goddamn storm instead of asking for help. And that's either the stubbornest thing I've ever seen or the loneliest. Maybe both. He stood up and held out his hand. A working man's hand, callous, scarred the knuckles thick from years of labor. Your choice, he said. But decide quick because I'm getting soaked and my horse is getting mean. Lena looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She saw no lie there, but also no promise, just an offer strange and sudden from a stranger standing in the rain at the worst moment of her worst night in 2 years of bad nights. She took his hand. He pulled her to her feet with surprising gentleness, steadying her when she swayed. Up close, he smelled like horse and leather and wood smoke, like work, like someone who didn't have time for cruelty because cruelty was a luxury and luxuries cost too much. Can you ride? He asked. I can sit, she said. Good enough. His horse was tied outside the saloon, a big roan mare with a white blaze and an expression that communicated with remarkable clarity that she had serious reservations about the current situation. Wade helped Lena up, ignoring her wince when her ribs protested the effort, then swung up behind her. The saddle was slick with rain, and for a terrible moment she thought she'd slide right off, but his arm came around her waist solid and matter-of-fact. Hold on, he said, and they went. They rode out of Dustfall at a gallop, the town shrinking behind them into the gray, its lantern light swallowed by the storm. Lena closed her eyes and felt the rain on her face. She told herself this was not trust. Trust was something earned over years, not minutes. This was just survival, one more day, one more choice made in the dark. But Wade Calloway's arm was solid around her waist, and somewhere deep in her chest, in a place she had been keeping carefully cold for 2 years, something shifted like ice just beginning to crack. The ranch appeared out of the gray like something half-remembered. It wasn't much she could see that even through the rain. A house of weathered wood gone silver with age. A barn that leaned slightly to the left, its door hanging at an angle that suggested one hinge was living on borrowed time. Fences that needed mending. Land acres of it rolling away into the storm, brown and tired and thirsty. Wade dismounted first, then helped her down. Her legs nearly went out from under her when her feet hit the ground, but she locked her knees and stayed upright through sheer will. She had learned long ago that showing weakness was an invitation she could not afford. Barn first, Wade said, leading the roan toward the crooked door. Roan earned her keep tonight. The barn smelled like hay and old manure, and beneath those things, something else. The particular smell of neglect, of too much work, and not enough hands. There were two other horses in the stalls, both eyeing Roan with interest as Wade stripped off her saddle and bridle with practiced efficiency. "You know horses?" he asked without looking up. "I know how to stay out of their way." "Smart." He grabbed a brush and started working on Roan's coat, his movements economical and sure. "Most people think horses are gentle. They're not. They're just big and scared and trying not to get hurt. Same as everything else." Lena watched him work and noticed his hands steady. Confident, the hands of a man who had done this task 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more. She found herself studying the barn more carefully. Tools hung on the walls, some unused long enough to have gathered dust. A row of empty stalls that had once held animals. A sense of something diminished. "You live alone," she said. It wasn't quite a question. Wade paused mid-brush, then continued. "Who says I'm alone? This place." She gestured at the empty stalls, the unused tools, the general atmosphere of one person stretched across a space built for more. One man, maybe two. No more. He glanced at her with something that might have been surprise, the look of a person not accustomed to being read. Then he went back to the brush. "Yeah, just me now." A pause, carrying weight. "Had help once. Had a lot of things once. That was before." "Before what?" "Before everything went to hell." He said it without self-pity, the way a man stated a fact he had made his peace with, or tried to. She understood that. She had made similar arrangements with her own losses. When Roan was settled, Wade led Lena to the house. One main room kitchen at one end, sleeping area at the other, a fireplace taking up most of one wall currently cold and dark. A table, two chairs, a trunk, not much else. The windows were small, their glass smudged. The floorboards were uneven, scarred from years of boots and work and weather. It was the most beautiful place she had seen in 2 years. "Sit," Wade said, pointing at one of the chairs. He lit a lamp. Steady hands, no wasted motion. Then crouched at the fireplace and began building a fire. The kindling caught quickly, and warmth began to push out into the cold room. "You're shaking." Lena hadn't noticed. But he was right. Now that they were out of the rain, her body had decided to inform her in considerable detail exactly how cold and hurt and exhausted she was. She wrapped her arms around herself and watched the fire grow. Wade stood collected, a bowl, filled it from a pitcher, and pulled a cloth from a shelf. He carried them to her and crouched down again, setting the bowl on the floor between them. "Let me see that cut." "It's fine." "It's bleeding. That's not fine." He held out the cloth with a patience that reminded her unexpectedly of her mother. "You do it or I do it. Your choice." She took the cloth. It was clean, or as clean as things got out here. She pressed it to the cut above her eyebrow and hissed at the sting. "Someone threw a rock at you," Wade said. "Yes." "In town?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, his face hardening in a way that was subtle but clear, the jaw tightening, a stillness coming into his eyes that was different from ordinary stillness. "Who?" he asked. "Does it matter?" "Yeah, it matters." "Why?" "Because I need to know if they're going to come looking for you here." He met her eyes directly. "Whether they're going to be a problem." "They won't." Lena was certain of that. The men who chased her hadn't cared enough to follow their satisfaction, had been in the chasing, not the catch. "They wanted me gone. I'm gone." Wade didn't look entirely convinced, but he didn't push. Instead, he stood and moved to the kitchen, pulling out a pot and beginning to assemble ingredients, beans, bacon, and onion that had seen better days. "You hungry?" Her stomach answered before she could, a low sound that echoed in the quiet room. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. Yesterday, maybe. The day before. "I'll take that as a yes." While he cooked, Lena allowed herself to study the room properly, the kind of slow reading she had learned to do in San Francisco, when understanding your environment quickly was the difference between safe and not safe. Things told stories if you knew how to look. A rifle above the door, well-maintained, the metal clean and oiled. A shelf of books with cracked spines read, actually read, not displayed. A photograph on the mantel, faded and water-stained, showing a younger version of Wade with a woman and a small child, all three of them squinting into the sun with their faces turned up like they were trying to hold the moment. A pair of small boots by the door, child-sized, gathering dust. "They died," Wade said quietly. He wasn't looking at her, focused on the pot, stirring slowly. She hadn't said anything, hadn't moved, but somehow he had known what she was looking at. "My wife and daughter, 3 years ago. Fever took them both in the same week." Lena's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." Yeah. He ladled stew into 2 bowls and carried one to her. Me too. The stew was simple beans and bacon and onion. Nothing elaborate, but it was hot and it was real, and eating it felt like being pulled back from somewhere distant. Lena ate slowly, tasting each bite with the concentration of someone who had been surviving on less than enough for a long time. Across the table, Wade ate with mechanical efficiency, the way a person ate when they had stopped thinking of meals as anything other than maintenance. You've got a name, he said after a while. Lena Hao. He repeated it, the syllables awkward in his mouth, the tones wrong. I probably said that wrong. Yes, but that's all right. How long have you been in Dustfall? 2 months. Before that, San Francisco. Before that, Guangdong province. He nodded slowly like he was placing pins in an invisible map. Long way from home. I have no home, she said. The words came out harder than she'd intended. Not angry exactly, just blunt, with the particular weight of things that had been true for too long. Wade was quiet for a moment. Then home is where they don't chase you into storms. She looked at him. He wasn't offering comfort, he was just stating his own version of the same equation. She found to her surprise that this was more useful than comfort would have been. The fire crackled. Outside, the storm continued its work. The wind found every gap in the walls and reminded them both that the world beyond this small, warm room was still entirely indifferent to their arrangements. You can stay, Wade said eventually. Tonight. There's a cot in the barn, but the barn is drafty and you've already been wet enough. You take the bed. I'll sleep out there. Lena stared at him. Why would you do that? Because you're hurt and frozen and you've had a bad day. He stood collecting the empty bowls. And because it's the decent thing to do. Decent, she turned the word over. Here in this country, that word had been wielded at her like a weapon. Decent folk don't associate with your kind. Decent people don't want you here. To hear it offered as a simple reason without any qualification was disorienting. Decent, she said, testing it. Don't overthink it. He set the bowls by the basin. It's just one night. She woke to sunlight and silence. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory returned, the storm, the cowboy, the warm stew, the small boots by the door, and she lay still for a breath, letting it settle. The house was empty. Through the small window, the world had been remade overnight. The storm gone, the sky an almost aggressive blue, the brown land scrubbed clean and glistening in the early light. Wade was visible through the glass, moving near the barn, already working on something with the focused economy of a man who did not waste mornings. Lena sat up. Her body had filed its full report during the night, every muscle logging its complaint, the cut above her eye pulling tight as a new scab formed. She stood slowly testing her legs and found them functional. Sore, but functional. Outside, the air hit her like cold water, clean and sharp, and nothing like San Francisco. Nothing like the close, salt, heavy air of the coast. She breathed it in and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. You're up, Wade said when she came around the corner of the barn. He was mending a section of fence, hammer in hand, examining the damage with the resigned expression of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the scope of what needed fixing. How's the head? Still attached? Good sign. He gestured toward a bucket near the well. Water there if you want to wash up. Soap too. She washed. The water was cold enough to make her gasp, but the gasping felt right, clarifying, like it was rinsing something away. When she came back, her face still tingling, Wade had moved down the fence line and was wrestling with a post that had rotted through at the base. I've been thinking, he said without looking up. Lena waited. About you. About this place. He straightened, set the hammer on the fence rail, and turned to face her with the directness of a man who had decided to say something difficult and was going to say it straight. I need help. The ranch is dying, I can't run it alone, and I can't afford to hire anyone. You need work and a place to stay. Seems like those two problems could solve each other. She went very still. You want me to work here? If you're willing. It's hard work, long days. I can't pay much room board and a little cash when I have it, but it's better than sleeping in storms. He looked at her carefully. And before you ask why you specifically, it's because everyone in town would rather watch this place fail than see me succeed. They'd refuse on principle. And because when I found you last night, you were sitting in the rain bleeding rather than beg for help. Something shifted in his expression. That kind of stubborn is exactly what I need. Lena thought about San Francisco. about the boarding houses where she had scrubbed floors at 4 in the morning, about washing dishes at the Dust Fall Saloon for pennies while men spat near her feet and called it tolerance. She thought about the rock and the laughter and the cold wall at her back. "The town will hate you more for having me here," she said. "Let them. They already do. Then they'll hate me the same amount and I won't have lost anything." He picked up the hammer again. "What do you say?" She looked at the ranch, the listing barn, the tired land, the house with its small windows and its shelves of cracked spine books, and its pair of small boots gathering dust by the door. She looked at Wade Calloway, this stranger who had pulled her from a storm and offered her something no one else had a chance, plainly stated, with no false sweetness around it. "I'll stay," she said. "For now. For now is good enough." He held out his hand. "Welcome to Calloway Ranch. Try not to expect too much." She shook it. His grip was firm and calloused and entirely honest. For the first time in 2 years, Lena Hao allowed herself carefully and with both eyes open to hope. The first week was its own kind of storm, quieter than the one she had arrived in, but no less relentless. Lena had been strong once back in Guangdong, where she had worked her family's land from the time she could hold a tool. But 2 years of poor food and harder circumstances had whittled her down, and the ranch did not care about her past strength, only her current capacity. Everything hurt. Her shoulders ached from hauling water. Her back throbbed from fence work. Her hands, which had survived lye soap and hot water in San Francisco, were discovering entirely new ways to suffer under rope and post driver and the rough wooden handles of ranch tools. She did not complain. She had known walking into this that complaint was the one luxury she could not afford, not if she wanted to prove that the offer had been worth making. Colt noticed anyway. On the 5th day, she was carrying a bucket of grain to the barn, hands wrapped in strips torn from an old shirt jaw set against the pane, when Wade appeared beside her and simply took the bucket from her hands. "You're pushing too hard," he said. "I can do it." "I didn't say you couldn't. I said you're pushing too hard." He walked toward the barn without slowing. "You're no good to me if you break yourself in the first week." "I won't break. Everyone breaks. The question is whether you're smart enough to rest before it happens." He set the bucket down and turned to her with an expression that was firm without being unkind. "Sit. That's not a request." She sat on a hay bale and watched him disappear into the house. He came back with a tin of salve. "Give me your hands." I know you can. You're not going to." He crouched in front of her and waited with the same unhurried patience he seemed to bring to everything. Slowly, Lena unwrapped the cloth strips. Her palms were raw red and weeping in places, the skin torn back from the worst of the blisters. Wade looked at them for a moment without speaking, and the sound he made low in his throat told her more than he probably intended. "This is going to sting," he said, opening the tin. It did. She bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, but she didn't pull away. His hands moved carefully around the worst of the damage, working the salve into her palms with a gentleness that seemed to cost him something. Not effort, but something more like attention. Like he was making himself present for a task that required more than just his hands. "You worked a farm before," he said. "Yes. How do you know?" "Because you know which end of a shovel to hold. Most city folk don't." He began wrapping her hands in clean cloth, his movements precise. "But farm work and ranch work use different muscles. Takes time to build up." "I don't have time." "Why, you got somewhere else to be." Lena didn't answer. The truth was complicated. She didn't have somewhere to be, but she had something to prove. That she could earn this. That she wasn't a burden, wasn't charity, wasn't just another person waiting to be disappointed or used. In San Francisco, she had scraped by on sufferance. She refused to do that here. "You're afraid I'll change my mind," Wade said, reading her silence with an accuracy that was slightly alarming. "That I'll decide you're not worth keeping." "Aren't I?" He sat back on his heels and looked at her steadily. "In 5 days, you've fixed 3 fence posts, cleared half the main irrigation ditch, and reorganized my tool shed so I can actually find things. You work harder than any hired hand I've ever had. Why the hell would I want you gone?" "Because everyone else does." The words dropped between them like a stone. Wade's jaw tightened, a brief controlled reaction, and then he said quietly, "I'm not everyone else." "I know," Lena said. And she did. That was the strange part. Despite every instinct that 2 years of hard experience had built into her, she already knew that. On the 8th day, Harlan Voss came to call. Lena was working on the main irrigation ditch, the one she had been clearing, section by section, shoveling out a decade of silted earth and packed debris when she heard horses coming from the direction of the road. Three riders moving at an easy, deliberate pace that said they weren't in a hurry because they didn't need to be. She straightened and squinted against the morning glare and felt something cold settle in her stomach before she had consciously recognized any of them. She had seen Harlan Voss only once from a distance, standing outside the bank on Dust Falls Main Street, holding court with the easy authority of a man who had long since stopped distinguishing between influence and an ownership. He was younger than she had expected for someone of his reputation, maybe 40, with the kind of looks that came from money and leisure, well-fed, well-dressed, wearing a vest with silver buttons that had never once come within a mile of actual work. He was smiling when he dismounted. "Well now," he said, letting his gaze settle on her with the particular attention of a man inventorying something he was considering acquiring. Calloway didn't mention he'd taken on help, especially not such exotic help. One of the riders behind him laughed. Lena said nothing. She stood with the shovel in her blistered hands and waited, keeping her face neutral, reading the terrain the way she had learned to read all dangerous situations, who was where, what the distances were, what the exits looked like. "Where's Wade?" Voss asked. "In the barn." "Go get him." Not a request. The tone of a man who had said the same words so many times to so many people that he had forgotten there was any other way to say them. Lena wanted to refuse. The word was right there, simple, clean, sufficient. But these men had guns, and she had a shovel, and she was not stupid enough to make that calculation come out wrong. She walked toward the barn, feeling their eyes track her across the yard, and heard Voss say something low that made the others laugh again. She kept walking. Wade was mending a bridle when she came through the barn door. He read something in her face the moment he saw her and set the bridle down. "What's wrong?" "Men here. 3 of them. One is Voss." Something changed in Wade's expression. Not fear, but a kind of bracing, like a man who had been expecting a storm and felt the first drop. He stood up, crossed to where his rifle leaned against the wall, and picked it up. Not aimed, not aggressive, just held. "Stay here," he said. "No." The word came out before she had entirely decided to say it. "This is my home too." Wade looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Stay behind me. If things go bad, you run. Understood?" She followed him out into the sunlight. Voss was waiting near the well, his 2 men flanking him, with the relaxed patience of people who were used to having time on their side. When he saw Wade emerge from the barn with the rifle held loose at his, not raised but very much present, Voss's smile widened slightly, as though this were the kind of greeting he had been expecting. "Calloway," he said warmly, "been a while." "Not long enough." Wade stopped 10 feet away. "What do you want, Harlan?" "Just checking on my investment." "This isn't your land." "Not yet." Voss's smile didn't waver. "But we both know it will be. This place is dying, Wade. You can't run it alone. The smart play, the one I've been telling you to make for 2 years, is to sell to me now while you can still get something for it." His eyes moved to Lena again with that same slow inventory quality. "Though I see you've found yourself a novel way to delay the inevitable. I'm curious, does she work for wages or for other compensation?" Wade went rigid. The change was subtle, a slight shift of weight, the rifle moving a quarter inch, but Lena felt it in the air between them, the way you felt the temperature drop before a storm. "Careful, Voss," he said. His voice had gone very quiet, which was somehow more alarming than if it had gotten louder. "I've got nothing to lose, and you've got men here, so let's say you think very carefully before the next words out of your mouth." Voss raised one hand, palm out, still smiling. "I'm just asking a legitimate business question. No offense intended." His gaze slid past Wade to Lena. "And none to your employee, of course." "Get off my land," Wade said, each word carved from something harder than stone. "Now." Voss sighed with theatrical regret and remounted his horse. "Think about my offer, Wade. The price drops every time I come back. And next time," he glanced at Lena again, his meaning clear as water, "I might want different compensation." They rode out at a leisurely pace, unhurried, because men like Harlan Voss had all the time in the world, and they needed you to know it. Wade didn't move until they were out of sight. Then he let out a long, controlled breath and lowered the rifle. His shoulders didn't relax. Lena wasn't sure they would anytime soon. "That man," she said quietly, "wants you broken." He wants me gone. There's a difference. Is there? Wade looked at her. Broken means you give up. Gone just means you're not here anymore. He shouldered the rifle. I'm not planning on either. He won't stop. I know. He'll make trouble for both of us. I know that too. He turned toward the barn, and for just a moment, his profile against the bright morning sky looked like something old and weathered and stubborn, like rock that had refused every storm that had ever hit it. I've been making trouble for myself since I was born. What's a little more? Lena watched him walk away. She stood in the yard for a long moment, the shovel still in her hands, thinking about leaving. She thought about it clearly and honestly, the way she had learned to think about things without illusion, without softening. She could pack her few possessions and be on the road within the hour. She could go back to San Francisco, find another set of floors to scrub, build another wall between herself and the world. She went back to the irrigation ditch and kept digging. 3 days later, she went to town for supplies. Wade had tried to talk her out of it. Send me instead, he'd said. But the lame horse needed a second day of rest, and the ranch needed flour and salt and lamp oil, and Lena had met his concern with the flat practicality she'd developed as a survival mechanism. They already know I'm here. Hiding proves nothing. If I walk in there like I belong, some of them might start believing it. He hadn't looked convinced, but he'd let her take the wagon. She kept her head down in the general store. The clerk, a thin man named Jessup, who had the careful neutrality of someone who had decided staying out of things was its own form of survival, tallied her list without comment. She was loading the wagon when she heard the voice. Well, look what crawled back into town. 3 men, young all of them and drunk despite the early hour. She recognized one Roy Decker who had been among the group that chased her the night of the storm. He was watching her with the particular expression of someone who had decided for reasons that had nothing to do with her that humiliating her would make him feel better. Just buying supplies, she said. Quiet, level. Just buying supplies, Roy repeated in a high mocking falsetto, and his friends laughed with the helpless enthusiasm of people desperate to seem involved in something. On credit, I bet? With Calloway's money. He stepped closer. What are you doing to earn it, China girl? You warming his bed. That what this is? Lena's hands tightened on the wagon rail until the wood creaked. I work for him, she said. I earn my keep. I bet you do. Roy's smile turned ugly in the way that smiles turn when there's nothing good behind them. Must be real nice spreading your... That's enough. The voice came from the doorway of the general store flat, unimpressed, carrying the authority of someone who had stopped asking for things decades ago and simply stated them. Lena turned to see a woman standing there, maybe 50, with steel gray hair pulled back severely and a face that had long since forgotten any expression that wasn't necessary. She was looking at Roy Decker the way you looked at something you'd found on the bottom of your boot. Mrs. Croft, Roy said, and the alcohol bravado in his voice collapsed like a tent in a gust of wind. Go home, Roy Thornton. No, Decker. Take your drunk friends with you before I tell your mother every word I just heard. A pause. Go. They went. Not fast. They needed to believe they were choosing to leave, not being chased, but they went. Mrs. Edna Croft walked over to Lena's wagon. Up close, Lena could see something in her eyes that was tired in a specific way, not from lack of sleep, but from too many years of watching the same things happen to different people. You're the one working for Wade Calloway, she said. Yes. He treating you right. The question surprised Lena. She had expected judgment or warning or the particular variety of pity that people expressed when they wanted to feel useful without doing anything. Yes, she said. He's fair. Mrs. Croft nodded slowly like she was filing this information somewhere important. Then she said, My husband works for Harlan Voss, has for 10 years. A pause. He comes home some nights with a loose tongue and a guilty conscience. Tells me things. Lena waited. Voss is planning something. I don't know the details. My husband doesn't trust me with details, which is his particular variety of stupidity, but it's aimed at Wade and it's bad. And it will be soon. Mrs. Croft's eyes were direct, almost uncomfortably so. You seem like a smart woman. Smart enough to know when you're standing in a burning building. Why are you warning me? The older woman was quiet for a moment. Then because I've watched too many people get crushed by men like Harlan Voss and I'm tired of watching. And because Wade Calloway is one of the few genuinely decent men left in this valley. She turned to go, then stopped. He deserves better than what's coming. Then she was gone back into the store, and Lena stood by the wagon with her hands shaking slightly, in the sky very blue and enormous above the brown rooftops of Dustfall. She drove back to the ranch and told Wade everything. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. He was standing by the kitchen window, looking out at the yard, at the fields beyond the fence line, at the land that was brown and tired, but trying. "You should go," he said finally. Lena blinked. "What?" "Back to San Francisco. Or somewhere else, anywhere but here." He still wasn't looking at her. "I had no right to ask you to stay. No right to put you in danger because I'm too stubborn to admit when I'm beat." "You're not beat." "I'm close enough." His voice was rough, carrying the kind of tiredness that lived below the surface and came up at moments like this. "Voss is right about one thing: I can't run this place alone. And with you here, I'm just making you a target. Stop." Lena stepped it around the table so she was in his line of sight. He looked up. "Stop talking about what's fair to me. I know what's fair to me. I decide what's fair to me. Lena, you gave me shelter when no one else would. You gave me work. You treated me like a person instead of a problem." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to repay that by running." "A beat. Besides, you said it yourself, we'll probably fail, but at least we'll fail trying." Something shifted in his expression. Something that was not quite hope, but it was in the same neighborhood. "You're sure?" he asked. "No, but I'm staying anyway. You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the craziest. Maybe both." He laughed, unexpected, genuine, the kind of laugh that surprised both of them. And then he held out his hand and she shook it, and something between them settled into a new configuration that neither of them had a name for yet. "Partners," he said. "Partners," she agreed. The ranch work continued. The days fell into a rhythm, brutal and exhausting. And underneath the exhaustion, strangely sustaining, the way hard work can be when it's pointed at something that matters. Lena learned the land. She learned where the soil was good and where it was clay, where the fence posts were rotting through versus merely aging, which of the horses had temperament and which had sense and which had both. She learned that Wade Calloway was a man who said exactly what he meant, who showed competence rather than demanding it, who worked alongside her every day, without once suggesting that any task was beneath either of them. It was late afternoon when she found him staring at the old irrigation ditch, the section that ran northeast away from the fields toward a dry gulch that hadn't seen moving water in years. "This goes nowhere," she said, joining him. "It used to go somewhere." He crouched and ran his hand along the packed earth, tracing the line of the old channel. There was a spring up in the hills, small one but steady, fed these fields even through dry summers. He stood squinting toward the rocky hills in the distance. 3 years ago it went dry. Or blocked. I was never sure which. Lena looked at the hills. She thought about water, the way it moved where it hid the geological logic of it. She had learned to read water in Guangdong, where the difference between a living spring and a blocked one could mean the difference between a harvest and a famine. "I could find it," she said. Wade looked at her. "Those hills are rough country." "I know water." He studied her for a long moment. Then, "If you go looking, you take the rifle, you take extra water, you come back before dark, whether you find anything or not. Deal." The next morning, Lena set out before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge. The hills were deceptive, gentler looking from the valley than they actually were, their slopes rougher, their rock more unpredictable. She moved slowly, following the line of the old ditch as far as it extended, and then switching to instinct, reading the micro-topography, watching for the signs that water left even when it wasn't flowing. Darker soil where moisture had lingered. Certain plants that preferred damp ground, moss on the north faces of rocks. By midday, she was sweating and scratched and starting to doubt herself. By early afternoon, she was angry at herself for doubting. By mid-afternoon, she found it. Not the spring itself, not yet, but the signs: a patch of dark moss on a rock that should have been dry. A shallow depression in the ground that was damp to the touch, even in this drought. She followed the trace of moisture upward, stepping carefully, and found where the spring should have been. A rock slide. Not fresh, maybe 3 years old, which would explain what Wade had told her, but not ancient either. Boulders had come down from the slope above and covered the spring's outlet, entirely piling up in a heap that redirected whatever water was behind them into the earth rather than down the old channel. But the water was there. She could hear it, faint and insistent. A trickle trapped behind stones, still alive, still trying to get through. Lena sat down on a rock and looked at the pile of boulders and thought about crying and decided against it. She was too tired for crying. She was too tired for anything except the essential calculation the spring was there. The water existed. The problem was not absence, but obstruction. She could work with obstruction. She marked the location carefully, a cairn of smaller stones arranged in a pattern she'd remember, and started back down the hill, running the last quarter mile to beat the sunset. Wade was waiting by the barn door when she arrived, worry written across his face in a way he hadn't quite managed to hide. When he saw her scratched, dusty, grinning, despite herself, the worry resolved into something else. "I found it," she said before he could speak. "The spring, it's blocked, but it's there. I heard it." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He stepped forward and grabbed her shoulders and pulled her into a brief, hard embrace, his arms tight around her for just a second before he stepped back, looking slightly startled at himself. "You're crazy," he said. "You already knew that." "Yeah," he laughed. "I guess I did." Then more quietly, already moving toward the problem. "Can we move the rocks?" "Not alone. We'll need rope picks and the horses if we can get them up the slope. At least 2 days, maybe 3. We don't have 3 days to spare." "No, but what's the alternative?" He looked toward the hills for a long moment, at the darkening sky above them, at the land that was brown and thirsty and dying slowly. "No choice at all," he said finally. "We start tomorrow." That night, over beans and cornbread, they planned. Wade sketched the route on a scrap of paper, while Lena described the rock slide in as much detail as she could remember the angle of the boulders, the points of potential leverage, the places where the horses could get footing. They argued about approach, about tools, about whether the work was feasible at all. The argument felt good, purposeful, two people solving a real problem together, rather than simply enduring it. "Voss will hear about this," Wade said around the middle of the planning. "Once we start spending time up in those hills, people will notice. Let them notice. He might try to claim the water rights. If that spring feeds onto his property downstream." "Does it?" Wade paused. "No, the natural watershed runs east. Voss's Creek is fed from the other side of the ridge." He frowned, "but he'll argue it anyway. He'll find some legal angle." "Then we work fast," Lena said. "We clear that spring and build a channel before he can manufacture a legal theory to stop us. Once the water is flowing to your land established and documented, it becomes much harder to pretend it belongs elsewhere." Wade looked at her across the table with something that might have been admiration or recognition, the look of a person discovering that someone else's mind works the way their own does. "That's assuming we can actually clear it." "We will." "How do you know?" "Because I have to believe in something." She thought the words but said instead, "Because you need it, and I promise to help." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. They left at first light, both horses loaded with rope and picks and enough supplies for 2 days. The climb was brutal. The horses balked at the steeper sections, requiring patience and creative cursing to negotiate. And by the time they reached the spring, it was past noon, and both of them were already tired in the bones. Wade looked at the rock slide for a long moment without speaking. "Hell," he said, "I told you it was bad." "Bad doesn't cover it." He walked closer, examining the boulders with the practical eye of someone calculating load-bearing rather than panicking. "This is going to take more than 2 days." "Then it takes more than 2 days." He looked at her, then at the rocks, then back at her, and something in his face settled into determination. "All right," he said, "let's get to work." They worked until dark. The boulders were wedged tight, some of them requiring both of them hauling on a rope simultaneously just to shift an inch. By the time they stopped, the progress felt laughably small against the scale of the problem, and every inch of Lena's body was reminding her of its existence. They made camp in a hollow near the spring building, a small fire from scrub brush. Wade produced a flask of whiskey, took a drink, and passed it to her. "For the pain," he said. It burned all the way down. Lena coughed, and he smiled slightly, and for a moment the exhaustion and the fear of Voss and the impossible pile of boulders above them all receded, leaving just the fire and the stars and two people who had found each other in bad circumstances and decided for reasons neither could entirely articulate to keep going. "Tell me about China," he said quietly. "Your family." She was quiet for a moment. She didn't talk about her family. Talking about them made their absence too sharp, too present. But something about the dark and the firelight, and the particular exhaustion that strips away your defenses, made the words come. My father was a farmer, she said. My mother kept chickens and sold eggs in the village. I had two younger brothers. She watched a spark float up from the fire and die. When the soldiers came, they burned everything, said we were harboring people they were looking for. We weren't, we were just farmers, but it didn't matter. Her throat tightened. My father sent me away. Said I had to survive, had to make it to America, send money back. She didn't say the rest, that she hadn't heard from them in 2 years, that she didn't know if they were alive or scattered or dead. After a long silence, Wade said, my wife's name was Sarah. My daughter was Emma. She was 4 when she died. Lena looked at him. The fire threw shadows across his face, making him look older carved. Fever came through in summer. Sarah got it first, then Emma. I tried everything, Dr. Cold baths, everything I could think of. His voice was level, reciting. Sarah died on a Tuesday. Emma lasted until Thursday. I buried them both on the ridge above the ranch. I'm sorry, Lena said. Everyone is. Doesn't bring them back. He picked up a stick, turned it in his fingers. After they died, everyone expected me to sell and go. Voss offered good money, but I couldn't do it. This place is the last thing I have of them. Sarah planted flowers by the house. Emma used to sneak into the barn to feed Rowan sugar cubes. He looked into the fire. If I leave, I lose that too. Your wife, Lena said carefully, would she want you to suffer like this? Wade was quiet for a while. No, Sarah was practical. She'd tell me to sell, start over. He almost smiled. But I've never been practical. That's not a flaw. Feels like one most days. It got us this far, Lena said simply. Above them, the stars were extraordinary, a density of light that was only possible this far from any town, this far from the ordinary human world. Lena looked up at them and felt for a moment the strange freedom of being very small in a very large universe. Thank you, Wade said after a while. For what? For staying, for caring about this place when you had every reason not to. He was quiet for a moment. For making me feel less alone. Something tightened in Lena's chest, warm and complicated and slightly frightening in its intensity. You make me feel less alone too, she said quietly. Neither of them said anything more. The fire burned down. Above them, the trapped water trickled behind its stone prison, patient and persistent, waiting for someone stubborn enough to free it. The second day was worse than the first. They worked from dawn to near darkness, attacking the rock slide with systematic focus. The horses helped where they could, ropes around the larger boulders pulling on command, but some rocks were simply too massive, too deeply wedged to yield to anything less than hours of chipping and leveraging. Lena's hands bled through their wrappings constantly, the cloth soaking dark, and Wade's old shoulder injury, a fall from years ago he'd mentioned, flared badly enough by midday that he couldn't lift his right arm above his head without his face going white. He switched to his left and kept working. By late afternoon, they had shifted enough rock to see the opening where the spring's outlet had been. Just a gap, barely the width of a fist, but dark and promising behind it, and when Lena pressed her ear close to the stone, she could hear water close and reel and waiting. One more, Wade said, pointing at a boulder the size of a small cart that sat directly across the critical outlet. That one comes out, the rest will follow. It weighs more than both of us together. I know, but look, there's a crack there. He walked around it, examining the fracture line. If we wedge the pick in and use the horses for leverage, we might be able to tip it. Let gravity do the rest. It took an hour to rig. Rope threaded through the crack and doubled back, both horses positioned on the downhill side. Wade, with the pick wedged deep into the fracture, Lena ready to signal. Ready, he called. Ready. On 3, 1, 2, the pick bit. Lena signaled the horses and they leaned into the rope muscles, bunching hooves, finding purchase in the rocky soil. For a moment, nothing. Then a sound like the earth clearing its throat, deep and reluctant, and the boulder shifted. Keep going. Wade's voice was raw. The boulder tilted, teetered. The horses dug in, and then with a groan that seemed to come from somewhere geological, the rock rolled free and crashed down the hillside, taking smaller stones with it, in a cascade that raised a cloud of dust visible from the valley. When the dust cleared, there was an opening. Water came out tentatively at first, a trickle, almost apologetic, as though it had been waiting so long it had forgotten how to move freely. Then more. The trickle became a flow, cold and clear, following the ancient channel they had been tracing all this time, finding its way downhill with the quiet certainty of water that has always known where it needs to go. Lena stood in the flow and let it run over her boots and laughed. She couldn't help it. The sound came up from somewhere she had thought was too tired to feel anything pulled loose by the sheer improbable fact of what they had done. Wade was grinning, his face streaked with dirt and sweat and something that looked very much like disbelief at their own success. "I'll be damned," he said. "I'll be absolutely damned. We did it. You did it. I just pulled on a rope. We did it together." She held out her hand, he took it, and they stood in the flowing water. Two people who had been broken by very different things and had found each other in the wreckage, and it felt like something worth holding. They got back to the ranch late the following day. Roy Decker was waiting on the porch. Roy Decker was sprawled in one of the porch chairs with his boots up on the railing and the particular air of someone who had decided to make himself comfortable in a place he hadn't been invited into, which told Lena everything she needed to know about why he was here. He stood up when he saw them coming, and the smirk on his face had the quality of news he had been saving to deliver. "Where have you two been?" he asked. "None of your business," Wade said, dismounting with the stiff deliberateness of the man whose shoulder had been fighting him for 3 days and was now winning. "Mr. Voss thinks it is, especially when you're messing around up in those hills with water rights that aren't yours. That spring is mine, has been for 40 years. That's disputed." Roy tucked his thumbs into his belt, his voice carrying the self-importance of a man reciting a message he had memorized and was proud of. "Mr. Voss has a claim to that water, says it crosses his property downstream. He sent me to tell you personally any further interference with the natural water flow, and he takes it to the territorial judge." A beat, the smirk reasserting itself. "He also wanted me to mention he's been hearing complaints in town. Folks are uncomfortable with you harboring an unmarried Chinese woman out here. Talk about bringing in the territorial marshal, making sure everything is, proper." Lena felt the cold slide down her spine like something poured. She knew what that meant. The marshal wouldn't care about the truth. He would see a Chinese woman and a white rancher living together unmarried, and that picture would be all the story he needed. Wade moved before she could say anything. One moment standing by his horse, the next step he had Roy by the collar and slammed him against the porch post hard enough to make the boards shake. "Say that again," he said, his voice gone to something flat and quiet and genuinely frightening. "I want to make sure I heard you right before I break your jaw." Roy's eyes went wide. "I'm just delivering a message." "Then deliver it and get out." Wade's grip tightened for a moment and then released, stepping back with the controlled effort of someone pulling themselves back from an edge. "And if you ever speak about Lena that way again, message or not, you'll regret it in a very specific and lasting way." Roy straightened his collar with shaking hands, his face cycling through red and then white, before settling on a pale, deflated dignity. He got to his horse with considerably less swagger than he'd arrived with. "Mr. Voss won't forget this," he managed from the saddle. "Good. Tell him I'm counting on it." They watched him ride off in a cloud of dust, and then Wade stood in the yard with his hands still loosely fisted and his breathing slightly elevated, and Lena looked at him from beside the wagon. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. "Probably not." He unclenched his hands deliberately. "He'll tell Voss everything, make it worse." "I know." He turned to her, and the anger was already becoming something else, a heaviness, a recognition of the problem they were now more deeply inside of. "But I'm not going to stand there and let him talk about you like you're nothing." His voice steadied. "You're not nothing, Lena. You're the reason this place still has a chance, and I won't let anyone—" "I know," she said quietly. He stopped. Then after a moment, "Yeah, I know you know. I just needed to say it out loud." 3 days later, the water stopped flowing. Lena noticed at first she was checking the irrigation channel, verifying that the spring's output was reaching the intended fields when she realized the flow had dropped to a trickle. By midday, it was gone. By the time Wade rode up to the spring to investigate the channel, they had spent 3 days of bleeding work building, had been deliberately blocked with new placed stones, and what little water escaped had been redirected into a gully that ran in the direction of Voss's land. He came back with a jaw tight enough to crack. "Voss's men," he said, "had to be. He can't fight us legally, so he's fighting us practically. We clear it, he'll block it. We clear it again, he blocks it again." Wade shook his head. "This is his game now. Make us waste time and energy until we break." Lena thought for a moment. "Then we make it so he can't block it." What do you mean? We build something permanent. A real channel timber, reinforcement, stone set walls properly graded. Something so obviously established that a territorial judge would have to recognize our prior claim. Something that takes Voss's men more than an afternoon to undo. That's weeks of work. It'll cost money we don't have. I know. She held his gaze. But what's the alternative? He was quiet, looking at the dry channel at the fields that had been beginning to green and were now going brown again at the edges. Then we start tomorrow. They started at dawn. The work was different from the initial clearing, less about raw force and more about precision, about building something that would endure. Wade cut timber while Lena set stones, each positioned to hold mortared, with a mud mixture that would harden in the dry heat. They established a proper grade enough fall to keep the water moving, not so much that it would erode the channel walls. They worked in near silence most days, the kind of silence that develops between people who have learned to communicate in motion, who have stopped needing words for the basic choreography of shared labor. Other ranchers passing on the road would slow their horses to watch. Most shook their heads. A few stopped to offer opinions, usually pessimistic. One old man named Silas, who had known Wade's father, pulled up one afternoon and watched them work for a long time without speaking. "You're making enemies doing this," he finally said. "Already had them," Wade replied, not looking up from the timber he was shaping. "More enemies, then?" "Then I'm getting my money's worth." Old Silas was quiet for another moment. Then he climbed down from his horse and picked up a shovel. Word spread through Dustfall the way word spread in small towns simultaneously in every direction, arriving before any single messenger could have carried it. Calloway and his Chinese worker were fighting Harlan Voss over water rights. Most people thought it was principled and stupid in about equal measure. Some thought it was just stupid. A handful quietly thought it was something else. Mrs. Croft came one evening in her husband's wagon, the bed loaded with timber. She didn't look at them when she climbed down. She started unloading. "Don't ask questions," she said when Wade opened his mouth. "Just take it before I change my mind." Mrs. Croft. "I said don't." She set a beam down with the emphasis of a woman who was done with conversations. "My husband is going to notice the missing lumber and tell me I've lost my mind, and I'm going to tell him he should have thought of that before he went to work for Harlan Voss. I don't want to discuss it before that conversation happens." Wade picked up the other end of the beam and carried it without another word. Lena watched Mrs. Croft unload the second board and felt something complicated in her chest. Gratitude and surprise, and the particular ache of unexpected kindness from someone who had no obvious reason to offer it. They were running out of time. 2 weeks, Roy Decker had told them. And the channel was only half done. Then Lena came back from town one afternoon with news that cut the timeline in half. The territorial judge was coming. Voss had filed a formal claim. There would be a hearing in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, she told Wade and watched his face do the math. "Can we finish in time?" "I don't know. Maybe, if we work every daylight hour." "Then that's what we do." They did. Dawn became less a time and more a condition, dark to light, tools in hand, the point at which waiting became inexcusable. They worked past dark by lantern light when the work required it, which it increasingly did. Lena stopped tracking the accumulation of pain and started treating it as ambient information, like weather, present, significant, requiring adaptation but not cessation. On the 5th day of this new urgency, she found Wade on his knees by the channel. She dropped what she was carrying and ran. "I'm fine," he said before she reached him. His voice was weak in a way that made the words functionally meaningless. "You're not fine." She reached him and put her hand to his forehead and felt the heat of it like touching a stove. "You have a fever. Just tired." "Wade." She got an arm around him and helped him sit properly against a timber. "You have a fever. This stops. The hearing is in 9 days. And you'll be dead in 9 days if you don't rest." She kept her voice flat and certain, which took more effort than it appeared. "You're going back to the house, now." He tried to stand. She caught him. His weight against her shoulder was heavier than it should have been, which told her more than the fever alone. Getting him to his horse, getting him mounted, leading him down the slope to the ranch, these things took the better part of an hour and all of Lena's reserves of controlled panic. By the time they reached the ranch house, he was barely holding his seat. She got him inside, got him on the bed, stripped off his outer shirt. His skin was fire hot, and his breathing was too shallow. Fever. The word landed in her chest with particular cruelty, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the photograph on the mantel and the small boots by the door. She got cold water from the well and soaked rags and pressed them to his forehead, his neck, his wrists. She built up the fire because the fever was trying to cook him from the inside, and paradoxically, the cold rags needed something to work against. She changed the rags when they warmed forced water between his lips. When he was conscious enough to swallow, sat beside him when he wasn't, and listened to him breathe. He spoke in fragments, sometimes in English, sometimes in something she couldn't follow. Once he said Sarah's name quietly in a tone that had no performance in it, just grief, simple and old, and still present. "You don't get to die," Lena said to the room, to him, to whatever was listening. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "You hear me? You don't get to bring me here, make me care about this place, about you, and then die. That is not fair." His eyes opened. They were glassy, but present, and they found her face in the lamplight. "Lena," he said, "I'm here." His hand moved toward hers, found it gripped with a fraction of his ordinary strength. "The channel, Ma. Forget the channel." "Can't. Need to." He stopped, swallowed with a difficulty. "Promise me. If I don't promise you'll finish it, you're going to finish it yourself. Promise me anyway." She looked at his face, exhausted, insistent, stubborn even now, and understood that arguing would cost him something he needed for recovery. "I promise," she said quietly. "I promise." He closed his eyes. She sat beside him through the night. The fever broke near dawn. One moment it was there, the terrible, steady heat of it, and then it wasn't, and he was drenched in sweat and shivering and gasping for breath that was suddenly mercifully easier. Lena piled blankets on him and kept the fire high, and finally, with her back against the wall beside the bed, allowed herself to breathe normally. She dozed in the chair. When she woke properly, sunlight was coming through the small window at an angle that said mid-morning, and Wade was watching her. "You stayed," he said. His voice was hoarse but clear, genuinely clear. The fog burned out of it. "Of course I stayed. The channel is still there. It will wait." She stood testing her own exhaustion, which was considerable. "How do you feel?" "Like I was thrown by a horse." He tried to sit up, managed it with effort. "How long was I out?" "About 12 hours. Fever broke at dawn." She brought him water, helped him hold the cup. "You scared me." "Sorry." "Don't be sorry. Don't do it again." She set the cup down. "You pushed too hard." "We both did." "You more." She sat back down. "Tell me about Emma." He looked up, surprised. "Why?" "Because you mention her, but you never talk about her. What was she like?" Something moved across his face, grief and love so intertwined they had become indistinguishable. "She was loud," he said finally, a faint involuntary smile. "Always running, always asking questions. Drove Sarah a little crazy in the best way." He was quiet for a moment. "She loved the horses, used to sneak into the barn to give Roan sugar cubes she'd steal from the kitchen. Sarah would find her sitting in the stall just talking to her." He stopped. The smile faded. "The day she got sick, she asked me to take her riding. I said later. I was busy with something that seemed important." His voice cracked just slightly, and then he controlled it. There was no later. Lena reached out and took his hand. "You couldn't have known." "I know that. Doesn't change it." "No." She held his hand steadily. "But don't choose wrong now. Rest today. Let your body do what it needs to do. Tomorrow we work together and we finish what we started." He looked at their joined hands for a long moment, then at her face with an expression that had something raw in it, something too close to the surface, too recently unearthed by fever and exhaustion to be properly defended. "Why do you care so much?" he asked. "You could leave. Find work somewhere safer. Why stay and fight for a place that isn't yours?" The honest answer rose up in her before she could shape it into something more careful. "Because you're the first person in 2 years who looked at me and saw a person," she said. "Not a foreigner, not a problem to manage, not something to use or discard. A person." She felt her throat tighten and kept her voice steady anyway. "When I'm here working beside you, I feel like I matter. Like I'm building something instead of just surviving." Wade's grip on her hand tightened. "You do matter, Sheriff," he said quietly. "More than you know." They stayed like that for a moment, hands clasped, something unspoken moving between them with the patience of water, finding its way through stone. Then Lena cleared her throat, stood and said she was going to check the animals. She left before he could say whatever he had been about to say because she wasn't ready to hear it yet. Wasn't ready to name the thing that had been growing between them since the night in the rain, warm and dangerous and more real than she had expected anything here to be. Outside, the morning was clear and cold and enormous. She fed the horses and thought about his hand in hers and told herself it didn't mean what she was afraid it meant. Told herself that twice more and didn't entirely believe it either time. Wade rested for one day. On the second morning, he was up before her, already dressed, already moving toward the door, with the deliberate care of a man who was not yet well but had decided that wellness was a secondary consideration. "You should stay another day," Lena said. "7 days left," he said. "I'm not wasting one." She saddled both horses. They rode up to the channel together in the early light and found fresh damage. 3 of the timber supports torn out, the stones disturbed the work of 2 days undone in what had probably taken Voss's men an hour. Wade stood looking at it for a long moment. His face was controlled, but she could see the effort that control required. "They're not even pretending anymore," he said. "No, how long to fix it? Half a day if the foundation holds." He dismounted carefully, favoring his right shoulder. "Let's find out." They were still working 2 hours in when they heard horses. Lena straightened and turned and counted 3 riders, and the one in front wore a vest with silver buttons that caught the morning light. Harlan Voss dismounted with the ease of a man visiting something he already considered his own. "Calloway," he said pleasantly. "I have to admit I'm impressed. You've actually made real progress up here." He walked closer, examining their work with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. "Too bad it's all going to be ruled illegal." "The judge hasn't ruled yet," Wade said. "He will. And when he does all of this," Voss gestured at the channel, "the weeks of work becomes mine. The water rights, the access, everything." He looked at Lena with that familiar measuring quality. "Though I'm willing to discuss terms. Sign the ranch over to me, now avoid the hearing entirely. I'll let you both stay on as hired hands." "No," Wade said. "Think about it carefully. You're not going to win this, Wade. You know that. The judge is a reasonable man, but he understands property law. My claim is legitimate that water crosses my land downstream. Your little construction project doesn't change. If your claim is so legitimate," Lena said, "why are your men up here at night pulling out our timber?" Voss turned to her with the patient condescension of someone who had long since decided that only certain people's words required serious responses. "I don't know anything about that. If there's been interference with your work—" "There has been." "Well," he spread his hands, "that's unfortunate, but it has nothing to do with me." A pause, then the tone shifted, still smooth, but with an edge appearing beneath it now. "I'll tell you what else has been discussed in town, Mrs." He looked at her with a slight frown, as though the form of address were distasteful, or whatever the appropriate term is. "People are uncomfortable. An unmarried Chinese woman living with a white rancher. There's been talk about asking the territorial marshal to come out and verify that everything is proper." Lena felt the cold certainty of it settle over her again. She looked at Wade, whose face had gone very still, not blank, but controlled in the particular way of a person who was choosing with great care which battle to fight in which order. "7 days, Calloway," Voss said, mounting his horse with practiced ease. "After the hearing, none of this will be your problem to solve. Think about my offer. It's more than fair for a dying operation." His eyes moved to Lena one last time. "For all of it." He rode away. Wade didn't move until the sound of hooves faded. Then he turned to Lena and said, "There's one way to stop that threat. The martial threat." She waited. "If we were married," he said, and he wasn't looking at her quite directly, "you wouldn't be an unmarried Chinese woman living with a white rancher. You'd be my wife, legally. That closes the angle Voss is trying to use." The air between them was very still. "It would be a legal arrangement," Wade continued, and she could hear the care in his voice, the effort he was making to give her room. "For protection. We go to the Reverend, sign the papers, and nothing has to change. It's a practical measure." "Everything would change," Lena said. "On paper. Just on paper." She looked at him, at this stubborn, tired, decent man standing in the ruins of a work he had poured himself into in the shadow of a threat he could not fight alone, proposing a solution that required her trust in a way that nothing else so far had required it. Everything she knew about him told her that trust was not misplaced. Everything she knew about the world told her to be careful. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes. Yes, I'll marry you." Something moved through his expression. Relief in something more complicated and something he was clearly deciding not to examine too closely right now. We'd go tomorrow, before Voss hears about it and finds a way to block it. All right. And then we come back here and finish the channel. Yes. They looked at each other in the mountain light with the sound of the freed spring running nearby, and 7 days left before everything they had built would face its real test. The enormity of what they had just agreed to sat between them, practical and terrifying, and underneath both something that was neither. They went back to work. They rode into dustfall in the hour before full sunrise when the town was just beginning to breathe smoke from its chimneys and the shopkeepers were still debating whether to unlock their doors. Reverend Marsh answered on the second knock, already dressed, his thin face showing the automatic wariness of a man who had learned that early morning visitors rarely brought simple news. "Calloway," he said. "What brings you? We need you to marry us," Wade said. "Now." Marsh looked at him, then at Lena, then back at Wade with the expression of someone recalibrating a situation he had not anticipated. "Both of you," he said, which Lena noted was technically a reasonable question given the circumstances. "Both of us," Wade confirmed. "There are usually preparations, bands a waiting period." "Reverend?" Wade's voice was not unkind, but it was clear. "I'm asking you to do this today without the usual questions, because there are people who would rather it not happen, and time is short. I would consider it a personal favor." Marsh studied them for another moment, long enough that Lena braced herself for refusal. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in, I'll need a witness. Mrs. Croft lives next door, and she's always up early." While Marsh went to fetch her, Lena and Wade stood in the Reverend's small parlor among his faded scripture verses and a painting of mountains that looked nothing like any mountains in Wyoming. The silence between them was the particular kind that arrived when two people had committed to something before either of them had fully absorbed what it meant. "You can still," Wade started. "I know I can," Lena said. "I'm not going to." He nodded. She thought she could see him decide in real time to stop offering her exits. Mrs. Croft came in with the composure of a woman who had been prepared on some level for this specific event. She looked at them both with sharp eyes that said she understood exactly what was happening and exactly why, and she said nothing except that she was glad to serve as witness. The ceremony was brief. Marsh read from his Bible in the flat, efficient tone of a man who had conducted too many of these to be sentimental. He asked the necessary questions. Wade answered steadily. Lena answered in the same careful English she used for everything important, precise without ornamentation. "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health until death do you part?" "I do." "Do you take this man?" "I do." Wade produced a ring, simple gold worn smooth, and when he slipped it onto her finger, he said quietly, "My mother's," without quite meeting her eyes, and Lena felt the weight of it settle around something she wasn't prepared to examine yet. "You may kiss your bride," Marsh said. Wade looked at her. She could see the uncertainty in that careful asking, and then he leaned in and kissed her, brief and simple and entirely unlike the way she had been bracing herself to feel, which was numb. She felt everything. It lasted 2 seconds, and afterward the room seemed different, the same dimensions rearranged into a new configuration. "Congratulations," Marsh said, closing his Bible. "You're married." They signed the paperwork. Mrs. Croft signed as witness with the steady hand of a woman who had made up her mind. When it was done, Marsh shook Wade's hand and looked at Lena with something that had softened slightly from his usual expression. "I hope you'll both be well," he said. They left quickly. They were halfway out of town when Roy Decker stepped out of the saloon doorway and stopped at the sight of them, Lena's ringed hand, the set of Wade's posture, the particular air of people who have just done something irrevocable. "Hell," Roy said, "you actually married her." "That's right. Wade Calloway married to a—" He shook his head with the theatrical disgust of someone who needed an audience for it. "Your daddy must be rolling in his grave. My daddy would have liked her a damn sight more than he ever liked you." Wade moved his horse forward, slow and deliberate. "Get out of our way." Roy didn't step aside immediately. His face cycled through something defiance calculation, the math of what Wade had just said and whether he could afford to contest it, and then he stepped back, not quite quickly enough to look willing. "Voss is going to hear about this," he called after them. "Good," Wade said without looking back. "Tell him we're legal now. That should address his concerns about propriety." They rode out of Dustfall in the early morning light with the eyes of the town on their backs, some hostile, Some scandalized, a few carrying the particular quality of people watching something they didn't entirely understand but suspected was significant. Lena kept her chin up and her eyes forward and thought, I am Lena Calloway now. She turned the thought over and found it strange and real in equal measure. You all right? Wade asked once they were clear of the last buildings. I don't know, she said. Are you honestly no idea? He glanced sideways at her. That was probably the strangest thing I've ever done. Same, a pause. But it's done. For better or worse, he said. Those were part of the vows. Yes, they were. They rode in silence for a while, the sun climbing the brown land, running out on either side of them. Then Lena said, thank you for doing this. I know it wasn't. It was. Wade cut her off gently but clearly. Lena, I married you because I wanted to, not just for the protection, not just to close the angle Voss was using. He paused, looking at the road ahead. Working beside you these past weeks, I've felt more alive than I have in 3 years. You make me believe this place can be saved. And when I had that fever and I thought I might not, he stopped, started again. The thing that scared me most wasn't dying. It was the idea of never seeing you again. The road was very quiet. The roan's hooves made a steady rhythm on the packed earth. I'm not asking for anything, he continued. I know this isn't what you came here for, but I wanted you to know this wasn't just practical. For me. Lena looked at him, at his profile against the wide Wyoming sky, stubborn and tired and honest in a way that had been consistently inconveniently difficult to defend herself against. I want to stay, she said quietly. I want this to work, not just the ranch. She looked forward again. All of it. She felt him look at her, and she heard something shift in his breathing, and then he reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and they rode back toward the work that was still waiting for them, hand in hand, and married and thoroughly terrified. And something else, too, something that didn't have a clean name but felt against all reasonable expectation like the right direction. Back to the channel, back to the work. 5 days of it. 5 days that ran from dark to dark, that took everything and demanded more. The timber supports went in deep, braced and staked. The stone walls were set in courses, each one checked for level and stability before the next was laid. The grade was established and re-established, corrected, tested with buckets of water to verify the flow rate before the channel walls were built up around it. On the evening of the 5th day, they drove the last stake into the last support post, and Lena stood in the flowing water and looked at what they had made. It was not beautiful. It was functional and solid and real, a thing that would outlast the winter and the spring and the people who had built it. Water ran through it with the quiet certainty of something that all had found where it was supposed to be. It's done, Wade said, coming to stand beside her. Yes. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he reached for her hand and she laced her fingers through his, and they stood in the mountain water watching the last light leave the skisham. Tomorrow was the hearing. Tomorrow Harlan Voss would make his case, and Judge Aldrich would rule, and the future of everything they had built, physical and otherwise, would be decided by a man in a suit who had never touched this particular piece of earth. But tonight the water ran. Tonight the channel held. Tonight, after weeks of fear and work, and something that had grown between two damaged people in the way that things sometimes grew in unlikely soil, quietly, insistently refusing to stop tonight, was enough. The town hall of Dustfall smelled of old wood and the accumulated weight of contested decisions. Lena had been in rooms like this before, spaces where power was distributed by men who understood the rules. They themselves had made rooms where someone like her was at a structural disadvantage before anyone had said a word. She sat straight, her hands in her lap, her expression clear. Judge Warren Aldrich arrived at 10 o'clock with the punctuality of a man who had spent 30 years refusing to let other people's delays become his problem. He was in his 60s, white-haired, with a face that had been carved into its current configuration by decades of making decisions that other people then had to live with. He looked like a man who had stopped being impressed by things a long time ago, which Lena decided was either very good or very bad for them. Voss's side of the room was well appointed. The man himself, his lawyer, thin, expensive-suited, radiating the confidence of someone who charged by the hour and had enough clients to be selective, and several associates whose presence was decorative rather than functional, designed to fill space and suggest resources. Wade and Lena sat across the aisle with old Silas and Mrs. Croft and a small group of other faces, the people who had brought timber and advice and their quiet, understated belief that this was worth fighting for. Voss's lawyer opened with smooth competence prior appropriation downstream water rights, the artificial diversion created by Wade's channel. He spoke for 10 minutes and said nothing that wasn't technically plausible and nothing that was entirely true. Wade spoke next, and he was less polished but more specific. 40 years of documented use, his father's journals, the spring's natural watershed. When he held up the worn leather journal and the lawyer objected to a private document as evidence, Judge Aldrich silenced him with a look and said, "I'll decide what's evidence." Then the judge said something no one in the room had expected. "I want to see the spring. We're riding out." Voss's lawyer opened his mouth. Aldrich cut him off. "I said what I said, Mrs. Calloway." He looked directly at Lena. "You worked on this channel. You're coming too." They rode in a procession up the slope, Lena. At the front, showing the route Aldrich, behind her asking questions she answered with the specificity of someone who had learned the land in the most direct possible way by working it. She showed him the old channel line that the new construction followed. She showed him the timber and stonework that grade the points where they had encountered the greatest obstruction. She showed him where the spring had been blocked and how they had cleared it. At the spring itself, Aldrich dismounted and examined the rock slide in silence for several minutes. He crouched down and felt the stone. He looked at the direction of water flow. He walked to the edge of the watershed divide that Lena had identified and studied the terrain below it. "If you block this channel," he said to her, "where would the water go?" "Nowhere toward Mr. Voss's property," she said. "The natural grade runs east. His creek is fed from springs on the other side of that ridge. This spring has no natural path to his land." Voss's lawyer jumped in. "Your Honor, Mrs. Calloway is hardly a qualified..." "She knows water," Aldrich said simply. "I've been watching her read this land for the past hour, and she knows what she's looking at." He stood dusting off his hands. "I agree with her assessment. This water doesn't naturally reach your property, Mr. Voss. Your claim is based on what you theorize might happen underground, which you cannot demonstrate." He turned to face the group. "I'm ruling in favor of Mr. Calloway. The spring and the water rights belong to him. This hearing is concluded." Voss's face went dark red. "This is concluded," Aldrich repeated and mounted his horse. Lena's knees felt soft in a way she did not allow to show. They had won. The word was enormous and simple, and she turned it over once carefully to make sure it was real. Voss turned to Wade when the judge had ridden off and the charm was gone, entirely replaced by something more honest and considerably uglier. "You think this is over," he said. "One ruling, I can make your life hell. No one in town will do business with you. You can do whatever you want," Lena said. Voss looked at her with cold, specific dislike. "It won't change what we have," she continued. "We have water, we have land, we have each other. That's more than you have, Mr. Voss, with all your money and all your plans, because what you have is a long list of things you have taken from other people and called yours." She held his gaze steadily. "We built ours." Voss looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who had decided to wait. Then he turned his horse and rode. Wade turned to Lena. His face broke open into a grin she had never seen on him before, full and undefended, the grin of someone who had forgotten briefly that the world was hard. He picked her up. Not heroically, not performatively, just the simple physical expression of relief and joy lifting her off the ground for a moment while she laughed and grabbed his arms for balance. "We did it," he said. "We did." When he set her down, they were both breathless and grinning, and then he was kissing her. Not the brief, careful kiss in the Reverend's parlor, but something real, something that tasted like relief in the mountain water running at their feet, in the weeks of work and fear and being seen, really seen by another person in the particular way that only happens when you have worked beside someone at the edges of what you thought you could bear. When they broke apart, he was looking at her in a way that was slightly terrified and entirely certain at the same time. "I'm falling in love with you," he said. "Maybe already have. I don't know exactly when it happened, but it did, and I can't..." He stopped. "I'm not asking for anything. I know this is supposed to be as to a practical arrangement." "I love you too," Lena said. He stopped. "I think I have since the night you found me," she said. "Since you looked at me like I mattered." She felt slightly reckless with honesty and found she didn't mind, which is probably insane given the timeline, but I've stopped making decisions based on what makes sense and started making them based on what's true. Something in his expression transformed like a window being unshuttered. "Yeah," he said softly. "Me too." He kissed her again. She kissed him back. Above them, the freed spring ran cold and clear and faithful, and the sky over Wyoming was extravagantly and differently blue. They filed the paperwork that afternoon, making Aldrich's ruling official and permanent. The clerk at the Territorial Land Office, a nervous young man who clearly knew whose side he'd been expected to be on, stamped and signed with the careful attention of someone who had just recalculated which way the wind was blowing. Then they rode home. The ride felt different from every previous ride Lena had made through this valley. The same brown land, the same wide sky, the same distance between Dustfall and the Calloway Ranch. But the weight of it had shifted, not gone, not simple, but oriented differently, like a compass that had finally found north. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we plant," Wade said. "Get the fields ready. Use the water we fought for." He was quiet for a moment, watching the land go past. "Build this place back into something. Think it'll work?" He looked at her sideways. "I like our chances better than I did 6 weeks ago." That evening, they sat on the porch and passed a bottle of whiskey back and forth. Sarah's whiskey, Wade said, kept for something worth celebrating, and he looked at the bottle for a moment before opening it with a gentleness that acknowledged what it meant and talked about the spring and the channel and Judge Aldrich's face when he'd looked at the watershed divide. They talked about Voss, about whether he would genuinely go quiet or simply find new angles. They talked about Mrs. Croft and old Silas and the handful of people who had shown up when it mattered. They talked around the edges of what had happened between them in the mountain light. Neither of them quite ready to name all of it directly. Both of them understanding that some things required time to become the shape they were going to be. "I need to tell you something," Wade said when the bottle was nearly empty and the stars were fully out. Lena waited. "When I married you, when I proposed it, I told myself it was practical, that I was doing it for the right strategic reasons." He looked at the bottle in his hands. "The truth is, I think I wanted a reason to make you stay that wasn't just me asking. Because I didn't know if you'd say yes to that, to just staying because I wanted you to." "You could have asked," Lena said. As could I?" She thought about it, about where she had been 6 weeks ago, about the wall she had built, and how carefully she had maintained it. "Maybe not," she admitted. "Maybe I needed the practical framing to let myself say yes to what I actually wanted. Which was this." She gestured at the porch, the dark land, the water she could hear faintly through the night, the house with its small windows and its cracked spine books. "Somewhere I'm not just surviving." He set down the bottle and reached for her hand, and she let him take it, the gold ring warm between their palms. "I was so alone before you came," he said. "I didn't even realize how far down I'd gone until you were here, and suddenly I wasn't anymore." "I was alone too," Lena said. I'd forgotten what it felt like to matter to someone." They sat in the dark and the quiet, and the coyotes called in the distance, and the water ran through the channels they had built, and both of them felt, without needing to say it, that this was what the whole difficult journey had been moving toward. That night, Lena moved her things from the cot to Wade's bed, not because she had to, not for any practical reason, because she wanted to, because this marriage they had entered as a legal arrangement had become something real, and she wanted to claim it fully. Wade watched her settle in beside him and said, "You sure?" "I'm sure." He held her close, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, and outside the water ran, and the land was dark, and everything that had been possible had become actual. The trouble with Voss did not end with the ruling. It did not end loudly either. Men like Harlan Voss were too careful for loud endings. They retreated, regrouped, looked for new angles. Over the following weeks, Lena felt his presence at the edges of things, a merchant who was suddenly less willing to extend credit, a supply order that arrived short without explanation, small frictions that were individually explainable and collectively deliberate. And then on a bright morning in late April, he came back. Lena was in the kitchen garden when she heard the horses. 3 riders again, the same formation as before, the same silver buttons catching the sun. She called for Wade and kept her hands still at her sides and waited. Wade came from the barn with the rifle, which he held loose and ready in a way that had become over the past weeks something that telegraphed neither aggression nor weakness, but simply the accurate statement that he was done being pushed. Voss dismounted and smiled at them both with the warmth of a man who had fully prepared for this conversation. "Beautiful morning," he said. "And what do you want, Harlan?" "One last offer. A fair price, more than fair, actually. Enough for you and your wife to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere you'd find more welcome." He paused. "And I'll drop any interest in investigating Mrs. Calloway's immigration documentation." Wade's rifle moved a fraction. "Her documentation is in order." "Probably. But I have it on good authority that there's someone in the territorial office willing to examine it very closely. Sometimes papers get complicated. Investigations take time. Status becomes uncertain." Voss spread his hands with false regret. "All of that disappears the moment you sign. I'm trying to give you an easy way out." "That's not a way out," Lena said. "That's extortion." Voss looked at her with the patience of a man who had decided she was a complication rather than a person. "Mrs. Calloway, my papers are legal. I came through San Francisco registered properly, have full documentation. Send whoever you want." She kept her voice steady despite the fear that was doing its best to turn her hands cold. "They won't find anything wrong." "Are you sure about that? Because I've seen how these things work." "Sometimes." "Get off our land," Wade said. The temperature of his voice had dropped to something that made the morning feel different, flatter, more direct. He raised the rifle to his shoulder. Not aimed yet, but the intention was entirely clear. Voss looked at the rifle, did the calculation. "You'd hang," he said. "Maybe, but you'd be dead." A beat. "Seems like you get the worse end of that arrangement." Voss held his position for 3 more seconds, long enough to preserve the appearance of choosing, and then remounted. "End of the week," he said. "That's my timeline." "It's also the end of our hospitality," Lena said. "Next time we won't wait for you to finish talking." Voss looked at her one final time with something that had gone past contempt into something more complicated, perhaps genuine puzzlement at a category of person he had not properly accounted for in his plans. Then he rode. They stood in the yard until the sound of hooves faded into the ordinary noise of the valley. "His documentation threat," Lena said. "That's real." "I know. We need to move first." Her mind was already working, assembling pieces. "If we go to the territorial office proactively, with my full documentation presented, before he can have it examined through compromised channels, we establish the record before he can corrupt it. That's a week's travel." "Yes, but Mrs. Croft said her husband told her things that Voss has been buying officials. If there's evidence of that." She stopped. They looked at each other. "His records," Wade said. "His records," Lena confirmed. The plan that emerged was desperate and specific. Voss kept documentation of everything: his transactions, his bribes, his land acquisitions, because he was both arrogant and meticulous. And arrogant, meticulous men believed their records were proof of their power rather than evidence of their crimes. Mrs. Croft, who moved through Voss's household under the cover of her husband's employment, had seen the safe. She knew the layout. The challenge was time. The window was the office during the day when Voss was present and occupied. "He needs to think we were actually considering the offer," Lena said. "Enough that he'll sit with us and talk about terms. Walk us through his holdings to demonstrate he can pay." "You want to use his arrogance against him." "I want to let him perform for an audience while Mrs. Croft looks for what we need." Wade was quiet for a moment. If this goes wrong, it goes wrong. But if we don't try, he wins anyway. He wins slower and we suffer more in the process." She looked at him steadily. "I would rather take a risk with some chance of ending this than accept a certainty of slow loss." They went to Mrs. Croft that evening. She listened without interrupting. When they finished, she was quiet for a long time, long enough that Lena thought she might refuse, which would be entirely reasonable and would force them to find another path. "My husband thinks I'm harmless," Mrs. Croft said finally. "He's been wrong about that for 30 years. She stood up. "What do you need me to find?" They arrived at Voss's house the following morning with the deliberately constructed air of people who had been worn down. Wade's posture was carefully engineered, not defeated, not aggressive, but the posture of a man reluctantly reconsidering. Lena kept her face neutral and her hands still, and her eyes taking careful inventory of every detail of the rooms they passed through. Voss was delighted. He took them to his office, the room of leather and paintings, in expensive confidence, and settled into his chair with the ease of a man who had seen this scene play out exactly as predicted. So, he said warmly, you've thought about my offer. We're listening, Wade said. Voss moved to the painting that concealed his safe with the theatrical pleasure of a man who had done this before and enjoyed the effect it produced. He spun the combination open the door, produced a ledger. He laid it on the desk between them and began walking through it, each entry a testament to how much he owned and by what methods he had acquired it. The Morrison place, he said, pointing, acquired last year, the Chen property 2 years ago, the Patterson acreage. His eyes flicked briefly to Mrs. Croft. Your husband made a good deal there. Mrs. Croft nodded. Her hands were folded in her lap. I need the washroom, she said, down the hall, second door. She left. Voss kept talking, walking them through his valley-wide acquisition, clearly enjoying the performance. Lena kept her face attentive and her mind tracking time. Wade asked careful questions, specific enough to seem genuine, not so specific as to rush things. 5 minutes, 8, 10. Voss was explaining the strategic importance of the Calloway Ranch's location in his overall plan when Mrs. Croft returned. She sat back down with the composed expression of a woman who had recently done something significant and intended to tell no one about it until the right moment. Lena met her eyes for a fraction of a second, a small nod. She had it. So, Voss said, closing the ledger with satisfaction, do we have a deal? Wade stood. No. Voss's expression shifted, the warmth curdling, the real face beneath showing through. I'm sorry. We're not selling. Wade's voice had found its flat final register, the one that didn't argue, didn't explain, simply stated. Not now, not ever. He looked at Voss steadily. And Mrs. Croft, while you were showing us your ledger, just finished finding the other set of records. The ones that show every official you've bribed, every property line you had falsified, every immigration office contact you've paid to manufacture problems for inconvenient people. The color left Voss's face. Mrs. Croft stood and set a sheaf of papers on the desk between them. Documents in Voss's own handwriting, signed, dated, specific. A bribe to the territorial surveyor. Payments to the land office. A letter to an immigration official with instructions that were unambiguous in their intent. These are your records, Lena said. Your handwriting, your signature. Voss's hand moved toward the pull cord that would summon his men. Wade's rifle was on the desk before the motion completed, not dramatic, just present. I'd think about what you do next very carefully, Wade said. The silence stretched. Outside through the windows, Voss's men were visible in the yard, present, armed, and entirely unaware of the situation inside. The question of whether to call them was a calculation, and Lena watched Voss perform at the documents in Mrs. Croft's hands, his own handwriting, the fact that 3 witnesses had just seen everything. He could take the papers by force. He could call his men. He could also end up defending himself against a set of charges that, with his own records as evidence, were undefendable. What do you want? He asked. His voice had gone flat, not resigned, but recalculating. Leave us alone, Wade said. Drop every threat against Lena. Stop interfering with our land. And, he gestured at the documents, make things right with every person you've cheated. That's what you agreed to, or we take these to the territorial governor and let him decide what they're worth. Lena's voice was steady. Your choice. Voss looked at her with a hatred that was almost clean in its clarity. No performance, no calculation, just the pure expression of a man who had just lost something he had considered inevitable. Fine, he said. They walked out into the morning sunshine, and none of them spoke until they were well away from the house. Then Mrs. Croft let out a breath that seemed to have been held for a significant portion of the meeting. I can't believe that worked, she said. Neither can I, Wade admitted. Lena looked at the papers in Mrs. Croft's hands and felt something she had not permitted herself in weeks, genuine relief. Not just the relief of a threat removed, but the deeper relief of a wrong that was going to be corrected. All the Morrisons and Chens and Pattersons who had lost land to Voss's machinations, they would get their stories told. Some would get their land back. Now we take these to someone who can use them, Mrs. Croft said briskly, reverting to the pragmatic efficiency that was her natural register. I know a lawyer in the county seat who has been looking for exactly this kind of evidence for 2 years. It took 3 weeks to unravel. The territorial governor's office moved with the deliberate speed of an institution that understood the implications. Investigators arrived. Voss's records were examined against independent evidence. Officials who had taken his money saw which way the tide was running and began providing testimony with the alacrity of the genuinely self-interested. Voss was arrested on a Tuesday morning, charged with fraud, bribery, and illegal land acquisition. He posted bail by afternoon. He still had that kind of money, but his empire was crumbling in ways that money couldn't fully address. The people he had cheated came forward. The officials he had compromised distanced themselves. The certainty he had radiated for years turned out to have been rented. Lena watched it unfold from the ranch where the work continued regardless. Water ran through the channels, seeds went into the prepared ground. The fields that had been brown and lifeless turned green in the way that growing things turn green, when they had what they needed, not dramatically, but steadily, inevitably, with the quiet persistence of life doing what life did. Other things changed with the same unhurried quality. The town did not transform overnight. Some people would never fully accept Lena. She knew this and had stopped waiting for their acceptance to be the measure of her belonging. But enough changed that it mattered. Merchants who had been cold became neutral, and neutral was an improvement. Families who had watched from a careful distance began to engage. The Chinese railroad workers in the valley who had been invisible by social agreement began to be slightly less invisible. Mrs. Croft became a friend, not in the expansive, demonstrative way, but in the way of people who have been through something together and do not need to perform the relationship afterward. She came for supper occasionally. She gave opinions without being asked. She and Wade disagreed about nearly everything practical and agreed about most things that mattered. Old Silas came by regularly, always with a reason, a tool to borrow advice about the North Pasture, an opinion about the coming winter, and stayed to work because that was how some people expressed things they didn't have words for. And one July afternoon, when the summer was at its height and the fields were genuinely, verifiably thriving, more productive than Wade had seen them in years, fed by the spring they had freed together, Lena was in the kitchen garden when she heard wheels on the road. A covered wagon, travel-worn, pulled by two tired horses. She didn't recognize it at first. Then it came closer, and the light was right, and she saw the face of the woman sitting beside the driver. The sound she made was not a word. It was something older than words. She was running before she had decided to run, stumbling over the garden furrows, crossing the yard with no thought in her head except the face she had been trying not to look at directly in her memory for 2 years, because looking hurt too much. Her mother. Linway climbed down from the wagon with the careful movements of someone who had traveled very far and arrived somewhere she wasn't entirely certain of. And then her daughter hit her at a speed that nearly knocked them both over, and they held each other in the bright July light, while Lena cried in a way she hadn't cried since she had left, not the controlled private grief of the past 2 years, but something full and ragged and cleansing. Her younger brother climbed down after, thinner than she remembered, older in the eyes. He put his hand on her shoulder, and she grabbed him too. Wade had come from the barn when he heard her call out. He stood a respectful distance away, hat in his hand, watching with the expression of a man who understood exactly what he was witnessing and had the sense to let it happen. When Lena finally stood back, her mother's hands on her face, both of them crying and laughing, in the mixed-up way of people who have found each other after loss, she switched to English. "Mama, this is Wade, my husband." She turned to Wade, her voice still rough. "This is my mother, Lin Wei, and my brother, Jian." Wade stepped forward and bowed slightly awkwardly, an honest attempt at respect across a cultural gap he was navigating in real time. "Welcome," he said carefully. "Your daughter saved this ranch. She saved me too. I'm honored you're here." Lena translated. Her mother studied Wade with the direct, thorough assessment of a woman who had survived soldiers and displacement and an ocean and was not easily impressed. Then she said in Cantonese, "He has kind eyes. You chose well." Lena's throat was too full to answer. She just nodded. In the weeks that followed, the ranch reorganized itself around its new population. Lena's mother moved through the house with the quiet efficiency of someone who had immediately understood what needed doing and had set about doing it. She worked in the garden with knowledge that made even Wade stop and pay attention. She cooked food that reached across the 2 years of distance and made Lena cry twice at the dinner table, which she felt no need to apologize for. Jen's 16 and wiry and determined learned ranch work with the focus of someone who had decided that understanding this place was the same as understanding his sister, which was the same as understanding where his family had ended up. Wade taught him to ride without comment and with genuine patience. "Your mother terrifies me," Wade said one evening, watching Lin Wei direct John in the proper staking of tomato plants. Good, Lena said. She's supposed to. Is that a Chinese parenting philosophy or just hers specifically? Specifically hers, I think. But she'd say they're the same thing. He laughed and she leaned into him, and they watched her mother and brother work in the evening light while the water ran through the channels below and the summer held everything it had promised. Voss's trial came in autumn. He was found guilty on 4 counts: fraud, bribery, falsification of property records, and abuse of official influence. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in territorial prison and ordered restitution to the people he had defrauded. His land empire was broken up through a combination of legal orders and settlements. Some properties were returned to their original owners. The valley began the slow, uneven work of redistributing what had been accumulated by force. Voss left for prison on a gray November morning without ceremony. Lena watched the sheriff's wagon go from the ranch gate and felt nothing dramatic. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but the quiet settling of something that had been holding tension for a long time, finally releasing. She turned back to the ranch. There was winter to prepare for. The first snow came early that year in late October, and the ranch met it with more than it had had in years: a full root cellar, a properly repaired barn with horses and cattle settled into fresh straw, a woodpile that reached the eaves of the house, and inside the house, for the first time in 3 years, more than one person keeping it warm. Linway took winter as an opportunity. She started meeting with some of the Chinese workers from the railroad camps, men who lived in the margins of Dust Fall's economy with no English and little protection, and teaching them the language, the customs, the particular vocabulary of self-advocacy. She had an authority born from having survived everything and a directness that cut through uncertainty. People came back the following Sunday and the Sunday after that. One December evening, sitting by the fire while snow hissed against the windows, Wade said, "I've been thinking about starting a school." Lena looked up from the mending she'd been working on. "Nothing fancy," he said. "Reading, writing, arithmetic for anyone who wants to learn. The ranch is big enough we could use the barn edition on Sunday afternoons. Your mother could teach," he paused, "and you could help. You're good at explaining things." Lena set down the mending and looked at him and thought about the missionary in San Francisco who had told her that words are survival, silence is death, who had given her language as the most fundamental tool. "Yes," she said. They started small, 5 children the first Sunday, 2 of them from Chinese families, 3 from ranching families who had made their peace with the changed nature of their valley. Linway taught in both languages, simultaneously moving between them with the ease of someone for whom the boundary between them was arbitrary and slightly irritating. Lena taught arithmetic and reading with the straightforward practicality of someone who had learned to value these things by needing them. Wade surprised everyone, including himself, by being excellent at history and geography. He could make the shape of the world vivid in a way that held children's attention. Word spread the way words spread in small communities, slowly then all at once. By February, they had 15 students. By spring, 22. Adults came. The Sunday school became something that people counted on in the particular way that reliable things become necessary quietly without announcement as part of the structure of life in the valley. Spring arrived. Harlan Voss, 6 months into his prison sentence, remained absent from the valley and showed no sign of return. His former associates redistributed themselves, some genuinely changed, some simply recalculating whose side was worth being on. The ranch thrived. The fields produced better than anyone had predicted. The spring channel ran clear and strong. The cattle were healthy. The 2 horses had become 4, and they were considering a 5th. On a clear morning in early April, Lena walked up to the ridge above the ranch where the 2 simple crosses stood, Sarah's and Emma's, with the wildflowers that Wade tended coming back through the thaw. She had never come up here alone before. It had seemed like private grief, not hers to enter. But today it felt right. She stood for a most time looking at the valley below, their valley, theirs, and the lands, and the waters, and thought about what to say. "I never met you," she said finally. Her voice was quiet in the morning air. "But I know you shaped him. The way he works, the way he's stubborn, the way he looks at people and actually sees them, that came from somewhere, and I think it came from being loved by someone who loved him the right way." She paused. "So, thank you for that." Another pause. "I'll take care of him, and the ranch, and the life you started here. I promise." The wind moved through the grass. A hawk called somewhere above the ridge. Lena stood there a while longer. then turned and went back down toward the sound of her family, her mother's voice in the kitchen, her brother's laughter from the barn, Wade's footsteps on the porch steps. "Hey," Wade said when she came around the side of the house. He had seen her coming from the ridge, and his expression was the one she had come to know as his most honest open, reading her, already understanding most of it. "Hey," she said. "You all right?" "Yes." She took his hand. "I am." He held it, and they stood in the April light while the water ran at the bottom of the valley and the school met in the barn, and Linway argued with old Silas about the best way to stake peas. And somewhere in the distance, Jean was learning to mend fence and calling out to Wade with questions that arrived already containing their own half-right answers. "I've been thinking," Wade said, about, about how I almost didn't walk past Chen's general store that night." Lena thought about that night, the rain, the wall, the cold, the point at which she had been very close to simply stopping. "I'm glad you did," she said. "Yeah," he squeezed her hand. "Me too." That was enough. That was in the accounting of things more than enough. The water ran. The land was green where it had been brown. The school met on Sundays. The valley was not healed. Healing was slower than a season, slower than a year, probably slower than either of them would live to see completed, but it was moving in a direction. People were learning to see each other slightly more clearly, which was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the thing most other things depended on. And Lena Hao. Lena Calloway, who had crossed an ocean with nothing, who had been made invisible by a world that found her inconvenient, who had sat bleeding against a wall in a storm and been found by a stubborn man who looked at her and saw a person. She stood in the spring light with water running at her feet and understood that she had arrived. Not at an ending, because there were no endings, only different kinds of continuation, but at herself, at the version of herself she had been trying to reach across all those difficult years of running and surviving. Someone who belonged here. Someone who had built that belonging with her own hands on her own terms alongside someone who had done the same. She looked out at everything, the green fields, the running water, the school and the barn, her mother's voice and her brother's laughter, and her husband's hand in hers, and she thought, this is it. This is exactly what I came for. I just didn't know its name until I found it. The water ran, the spring held, the story continued.